She was a woman who went from performing in the streets as an actress and prostitute to ruling the Byzantine Empire as Empress, and the scandal of her past never left her even as she wielded more power than almost any woman in history. Theodora rose from the absolute bottom of Byzantine society to sit beside Emperor Justinian as his partner in power, and along the way she accumulated enemies who spread rumors about her sexual exploits, her cruelty, and her hunger for control. But she also saved her husband's throne during the most dangerous moment of his reign, and when the moment came to choose between fleeing in shame or dying as an empress, she chose death and dared him to do the same. Theodora was born around the year 500 in Constantinople to a family that existed at the very bottom of Byzantine social hierarchy. Her father worked as a bear keeper at the Hippodrome, the massive arena where the city gathered to watch chariot races and circus performances, and this connection to public entertainment would define her early life in ways that polite society would never let her forget. When her father died after being mauled by one of his bears, Theodora's mother was left with 3 young daughters and no means of support beyond what the Hippodrome factions might provide. The family's survival depended on securing her late husband's position for her new partner, which meant appearing before the crowd at the arena to beg for their favor, a humiliating spectacle that introduced young Theodora to the brutal reality of powerlessness. Her mother trained all 3 daughters to perform, because in Byzantine Constantinople, women from their class had limited options for earning money, and entertainment was one of the few paths available even though it came with enormous social stigma. Actresses were viewed as little better than prostitutes, and in many cases the distinction between the two professions barely existed. Theodora began performing as a child, working in theatrical productions and circus acts at the Hippodrome alongside her sisters. The performances were often crude and sexually suggestive by design, because that was what the crowds wanted to see, and young women from poor families had no power to refuse the demands placed on them by the men who controlled these entertainments. By her teenage years, Theodora had gained a reputation in Constantinople for her beauty and her willingness to perform acts that other actresses would not, though the extent of her activities depends heavily on which historical source you believe. The main account of her early life comes from a historian named Procopius, who wrote a secret history of Justinian's reign that was so scandalous it remained hidden for over 1,000 years after his death. According to Procopius, Theodora worked as a prostitute and performed in theatrical productions that were essentially pornographic, descriptions so graphic and detailed that they read more like vindictive character assassination than objective history. He clearly hated both Theodora and Justinian with extraordinary passion, and his account must be viewed with extreme skepticism because he had every reason to exaggerate or invent stories that would destroy their reputations. What seems clear regardless of how much you trust Procopius is that Theodora spent her youth in an environment where sexuality was commodified and women had almost no control over how their bodies were used. At some point in her late teens she became the mistress of a government official who took her with him when he was appointed governor of a province in North Africa. This seemed like an escape from her life in Constantinople, a chance to leave behind the Hippodrome and the constant struggle for survival that came with being an actress. But the relationship fell apart quickly, and the official abandoned her in North Africa without money or means to return home, leaving her stranded thousands of miles from Constantinople in a situation that could easily have ended in her death. Instead, Theodora made her way to Alexandria in Egypt, where she encountered a community of religious believers who would change the entire trajectory of her life. She became involved with followers of a Christian doctrine called Monophysitism, which held that Christ had only a divine nature rather than being both human and divine as the official Byzantine Church maintained. This might seem like an obscure theological distinction, but in the Byzantine Empire, religious doctrine was politics, and choosing one interpretation over another meant taking sides in conflicts that could destroy entire communities. Theodora's conversion to Monophysitism was genuine and would remain with her for the rest of her life, shaping her actions as empress and creating tensions with the official church that she never fully resolved. When Theodora finally made it back to Constantinople, probably in her early 20s, she had changed in ways that went beyond her religious conversion. She was done with performing in prostitution, determined to build a different kind of life even though her past gave her almost no options for respectable employment. She supported herself by spinning wool, barely surviving while trying to distance herself from the identity that had defined her youth. And then she met Justinian, nephew to the reigning Emperor Justin and the heir apparent to the Byzantine throne. Justinian was already in his 40s when they met, well-educated and deeply involved in running the empire on behalf of his aging uncle. He was attracted to Theodora immediately, drawn by her beauty and intelligence in ways that transcended the enormous social gap between them. She was not just physically appealing but genuinely clever, capable of understanding political complexity and offering insights that most of the educated men around Justinian could not match. He made her his mistress first, which was scandalous enough given that he was a senator and she was a former actress, but the real shock came when he decided he wanted to marry her despite the fact that imperial law explicitly forbade senators from marrying women who had worked in the theater. The opposition to their marriage was fierce and came from the highest levels of Byzantine society. Justinian's aunt, the Empress at the time, was horrified by the idea of a former prostitute joining the imperial family and did everything in her power to prevent the union. But she died before she could stop it, and with that obstacle removed, Justinian convinced his uncle Emperor Justin to change the law itself. New legislation was passed that specifically allowed senators to marry actresses, though the language made it clear this was an exception being created for one particular situation rather than a general reform. The law even went so far as to legitimize Theodora's illegitimate daughter from before she met Justinian, acknowledging that she had a child born outside marriage and granting that child legal status. They married in 525, and 2 years later when Emperor Justin died, Justinian ascended to the throne with Theodora as his empress. She was not simply a decorative consort meant to produce heirs and attend ceremonies while remaining silent on matters of state. From the beginning she functioned as Justinian's partner in governance, involved in political decisions and exercising real power in ways that were unprecedented for a Byzantine empress. Her name appeared on legislation, she received foreign ambassadors and corresponded with rulers of other nations, and she maintained her own network of allies and informants throughout the empire who kept her informed about threats and opportunities that Justinian might otherwise miss. The court immediately filled with rumors and scandals surrounding the new empress, though separating truth from malicious gossip became almost impossible given how much people hated the idea of a former actress wielding imperial power. Stories circulated about her sexual past, embellished and exaggerated with each retelling until they took on a life of their own. Nobles who resented her influence spread tales about how she had gotten to her position, suggesting that she had used sexual manipulation to control Justinian and turn him into a puppet who did whatever she wanted. The fact that she involved herself in traditionally male spheres of politics and religion made her enemies even more determined to destroy her reputation, because a woman exercising that kind of power violated everything Byzantine society believed about proper gender roles. But Theodora did not retreat or apologize for who she was or where she had come from. She used her position to help women who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced as a young actress, establishing homes where former prostitutes could leave that life behind and supporting legislation that protected women from being forced into sex work against their will. She also placed her own allies in positions of power throughout the government, building a network that gave her independent sources of information and influence separate from whatever Justinian controlled directly. Her enemies called this cronyism and corruption, rewarding friends rather than merit, but that was how power worked in the Byzantine Empire, and Theodora played the game as well as any man. The defining moment of Theodora's reign came in January 532. Just 5 years after she and Justinian had taken the throne, when Constantinople exploded into violence during what became known as the Nika Riots. The immediate cause was a botched execution of members from the two major circus factions in the city, the Blues and the Greens, who had been arrested after street fighting between their supporters turned deadly. 2 of the condemned men survived their hanging and fled to a church for sanctuary. And when Emperor Justinian refused to pardon them despite appeals from the crowd at the Hippodrome, the 2 rival factions did something that almost never happened. They united against him. The riots began during chariot races at the Hippodrome when both the blues and the greens started chanting Nika, which meant victory or conquer, directing their anger at the emperor who sat in the imperial box watching the spectacle. When Justinian withdrew to the safety of the palace, the crowd spilled into the streets and began setting fire to government buildings. Within hours, Constantinople was burning and the mob was calling for Justinian to abdicate. Parts of the Senate saw this as their opportunity to replace him with someone more favorable to aristocratic interests, and they proclaimed a new emperor, a man named Hypatius who was nephew to a previous ruler and had a better claim to legitimacy than Justinian in their eyes. For 5 days the violence continued and the fire spread through Constantinople, destroying some of the most important buildings in the city including the original Hagia Sophia Church. Justinian and his advisors met in the palace to discuss their options, and the consensus was growing that he should flee the capital while he still could, escape by ship and regroup somewhere outside the city where he might raise an army to retake his throne. Running away would be humiliating, but it was better than staying and being torn apart by a mob that clearly wanted him dead. The advisors were preparing their escape when Theodora intervened with a speech that would be remembered for centuries. According to the historians who recorded it, she told Justinian and his counselors that now was the worst possible time to run, that being an emperor meant something more than just survival and that she would rather die wearing the purple than live as a fugitive stripped of her dignity. She said that royal purple made a fine burial shroud, that if Justinian wanted to escape there were ships ready to take him, but she was staying. It was one of the most dramatic moments in Byzantine history, an empress essentially daring her husband to prove he had the courage to keep his throne, and it worked. Justinian abandoned the plan to flee and instead ordered his generals to end the rebellion by whatever means necessary. What followed was a massacre that staggers the imagination even by the brutal standards of the medieval world. Justinian's troops, led by his best generals including the famous Belisarius, sealed all the exits from the Hippodrome where a huge crowd had gathered to support the rival emperor. Then they went inside and systematically killed everyone they found, cutting down men and women without discrimination or mercy. Contemporary sources estimate that 30,000 people died in the Hippodrome that day, roughly 10% of Constantinople's entire population slaughtered in a single afternoon of state-sponsored violence. The rival emperor Hypatius was captured and executed. The aristocrats who had supported him were punished or exiled, and Justinian's grip on power was secured through a level of bloodshed that left no doubt about what would happen to anyone who challenged him again. Theodora's role in this outcome was absolutely central, and there is no question that without her intervention, Justinian would have fled and likely never recovered his throne. But that victory came at an enormous moral cost, and it is impossible to separate Theodora's courage during the crisis from her responsibility for what happened afterward. She did not personally order the massacre, but she knew what would happen when she convinced Justinian to stay and crush the rebellion rather than flee. 30,000 people died because she decided that preserving imperial dignity mattered more than those lives. And however much you admire her strength in that moment, you cannot ignore what that strength enabled. After the Nika Riots, Theodora and Justinian ruled together for another 16 years, and she remained deeply involved in virtually every aspect of imperial governance. She advocated for legal reforms that improved the status of women in Byzantine society, including making it easier for women to divorce abusive husbands and protecting the property rights of widows. She supported religious minorities, particularly the Monophysites whose doctrine she had embraced back in Alexandria, even though this put her at odds with the official church and with Justinian himself who was trying to maintain religious unity. She corresponded with religious leaders and foreign rulers, she manipulated appointments to key positions throughout the government, and she exercised a level of independent power that made many at court believe she was the real ruler while Justinian just followed her lead. The luxury and opulence that surrounded Theodora as empress stood in stark contrast to the poverty of her childhood, and she embraced that wealth without apology or restraint. She wore the finest silks and jewels. She demanded elaborate ceremonies and protocols that reinforced her status as co-ruler rather than mere consort, and she expected absolute deference from nobles who had to swallow their contempt for her low birth and address her with the respect due to an empress. The contradiction between her humble origins and her current power never stopped being a source of scandal and resentment among the aristocracy, who saw her as a permanent reminder that the old social order had been overturned by an emperor willing to marry beneath his station. But beneath all the luxury and power, Theodora was dying. By her late 40s she had developed an illness that historians believe was probably cancer, though the medical knowledge of the time made accurate diagnosis impossible. She suffered for months with symptoms that grew progressively worse, and on June 28, 548, she finally died at age 48 or thereabouts, leaving Justinian genuinely devastated by the loss. He had depended on her for advice and support for over 2 decades, and her death marked a turning point in his reign after which he never seemed quite as focused or as effective as he had been when she was alive. The most remarkable transformation came centuries after Theodora's death, when the church that had been so scandalized by her past decided to remake her into a saint. The Eastern Orthodox Church canonized her alongside Justinian, erasing the inconvenient details about her youth as an actress and prostitute and presenting her instead as a pious Christian empress who had been devoted to religious causes throughout her life. The sexual scandals that had defined her reputation during her lifetime were quietly omitted from the official narrative, replaced by stories emphasizing her charity toward women and her defense of persecuted religious minorities. The woman who had been vilified by her contemporaries for daring to rise above her station was transformed into a symbol of feminine virtue and imperial piety. This reinvention says more about what the church needed Theodora to be than about who she actually was. The real Theodora was far more complicated and far more interesting than the sanitized saint that later generations created from her memory. She was someone who experienced genuine powerlessness as a young woman working in the streets of Constantinople, who understood from personal experience what it meant to have your body treated as a commodity and your humanity dismissed as worthless. And when she finally obtained power, she used it in ways that were sometimes admirable and sometimes brutal, helping women in situations similar to her own past while also enabling violence on a massive scale when it served her political interests. What makes Theodora's story so compelling is not that she was a saint or a villain but that she was fully human in all her contradictions. She rose from circumstances that should have destroyed her, survived abandonment and exploitation that would have broken most people, and then wielded power with a skill and ruthlessness that matched any man in Byzantine politics. She loved Justinian genuinely, worked alongside him as a true partner, and probably saved his throne through sheer force of will when he was ready to abandon it. But she also enabled a massacre that killed tens of thousands, manipulated political appointments to benefit her allies regardless of merit, and used her position to punish enemies in ways that her critics saw as vindictive and cruel. The Byzantine Empire that Theodora helped shape would continue for another 9 centuries after her death, but the legislative reforms and architectural projects that defined Justinian's reign largely stopped after she was gone. This suggests that her influence on his decision-making was even more profound than the historical sources acknowledged, that the partnership between them was so central to how the empire functioned that its absence left a gap Justinian could never fill. She had gone from being a girl performing in the hippodrome for survival to a woman whose advice shaped the policies of the most powerful empire in the Christian world, and that transformation remains one of the most extraordinary journeys from powerlessness to power in all of medieval history. The Church might have turned her into a saint by erasing the scandal of her past, but the real legacy of Theodora lies in what she actually did rather than in how later generations chose to remember her. She proved that even someone from the absolute bottom of society could reshape the world if they were clever enough and ruthless enough and lucky enough to be in the right place when opportunity appeared. She showed that women could exercise real political power even in a society that officially denied them any such role. And she demonstrated that survival sometimes requires making choices that history will judge harshly, because preserving power means being willing to use violence when the alternative is losing everything you have fought to achieve. That was who Theodora really was, and it is a far more interesting story than the sanitized version that turned a controversial empress into an uncontroversial saint.